past fall and fall 2013 in the Netherlands, and my presentation is going to be a reflection of that experience. So I just wanted to start with a note about this presentation. I did an independent study project while I was abroad titled Women of Color and Non-Dutch White Activism from Generation to Generation. I could have focused my project on this research, but instead I decided to focus my project on to make it a reflection of my experiences abroad, as my experiences as a person of color, and kind of what that means. And I'm tying this presentation into the OIE's mission statement about what it means to go abroad. So if you go to the OIE website, the OIE is the Office of International Education, and when they're listing what it is that they hope their students will get out of their study abroad experience, so that they're hoping that their students will understand their own identity and their identity's relationship to others, I added the identities in the parentheses, be sensitive to commonalities and differences among and within cultures, have the ability to understand multiple perspectives, be knowledgeable about global forces, both human and physical, understand how their status and actions impact others, and contribute responsibly to humane and positive change. So this presentation is going to focus on identity, and the purpose for this is that identity matters while abroad, in all caps. This presentation is an exploration of identity. I'm going to be giving a lot of information, a lot of history, a lot of background, a lot of personal stories, and all of that is related to my identity and how I understand the world around me. So, as I said, the focus is identity, because identity is influenced, or your experience is influenced by identity and how you see things. That's all interwoven. Some preparation that I took before I went abroad, I took Society and Culture, which is an intro to anthropology class, also known as cultural competency, social and cultural theory, and most importantly for this program specifically, Sex and Power, which is intro to feminisms with emphasis on the isms. We span feminism and the wave of it all throughout the course of that class. So we're going to start with who am I, the person on the left. So I hail from Plainfield, Illinois, which is a southern suburb of Chicago. I'm a junior psychology and anthropology double major with a possible minor in critical identity studies. That's really going to depend on what classes I get into in the spring. Racially, I identify as biracial, specifically African American and white, and I also identify as female. Little note on my program is that I studied SIT Netherlands, International Perspectives on Sexuality and Gender. My program consisted of American students, so all my students were from the States. However, I did have a Dutch faculty and staff, and so everything was taught in English, but they were born and raised in the Netherlands, or immigrated at least. And then some interesting components of my program, which I will talk about within my presentation, so that there was a 2-week excursion to Morocco. I had a month off to do research that I talked about earlier. We had some field trips and some weekend solo excursions. So starting off with living in Amsterdam, and again, more background information. In my immediate household, there was my host mom, my host sister Kat, as I like to call her, an exchange student from Germany, and an exchange student from New Zealand. And a note on the exchange student from New Zealand, he is both Dutch and Maori, and Maori are the indigenous New Zealanders. They are not white, and so we had a couple of conversations about that and how he was perceived by the white Dutch while he was there. And then I also had a community service project. I interned with Radio Redmond, which is an intersectional feminist collective, and I'll talk more about them later in my presentation. So more background. I'm going to give a mini Dutch history with regards towards race specifically. So we're going to go way back to the beginning of the 17th century with the Dutch East India Company, and basically what this company allowed was for a 21-year monopoly for colonial activity within India. Extremely detrimental to the culture, but that's a different presentation, I guess. As for the colony, or the countries who were most affected by colonization from the Dutch was Suriname, South Africa, Indonesia, the Dutch Antilles, and the Maluku Islands. So switch. Yeah, so I provided a map. I'm going to break a little bit. So we've got Suriname, where are you? South Africa, the Malaccan Islands, and Indonesia. And actually, this is New Guinea, but it says Indonesia, so that's kind of incorrect. I didn't make the map. But yeah, so just so that you understand regionally kind of, and then there's the Netherlands up there. So just so that you understand spatially where we're looking at in terms of colonization. A lot of the women that I spoke to in my research project, but also in a lot of literature research that I did, a lot of people talked about the way that people were split pre-70s was polarization, specifically religious polarization. So people broke off and discriminated based on what kind of religion that you were following. However, I'd like to note that certain countries practice certain religions, and so even though maybe the break was because of religion, also certain bodies of color are practicing certain forms of religion, which could be seen as a form of separation. However, a lot of women also noted a really dramatic shift in history, the Malaccan train hijacking in 1975 and 1977. So this is a rather long history of the Malaccan people wanted sovereignty from Indonesia, so they fought for the Dutch, who promised that, yes, we'll offer you this sovereignty if you fight for us. And instead, the Dutch transferred the Malaccan people back to Indonesia. And we're like, here you go. So this rebellion took place, and the Malaccans rebelled against the Indonesians. Didn't work out so well, and they were exiled, a forcible exile into the Netherlands, into these camps that were really badly taken care of in awful conditions, and two still exist today with people still living in them. And so there were a lot of Malaccans from later generations who were really angered that this independence was never offered, that was promised. And so they rebelled against the Dutch government. They hijacked a train in 1975, held people hostage for 4 days, killed a couple of civilians. It ended with them getting arrested in the 75 for a 14-year prison sentence. There were also a couple of other hijackings that day in like an elementary school. And the same thing happened in 1977. Again, more civilians died. I have accidental killing, as I found online. That is what happened to the Malaccans who hijacked in 1977. There's a suspicion that what actually happened to the survivors was that they were shot or they were killed when they were discovered by the Dutch. So just a really, really big thing happening, and a lot of people noted it as the possible beginning of racism within the Netherlands, because here it is that this fear is being instilled because of people of color, and that was something that the Dutch were relating. So we're going to move on to the theoretical focus of my presentation, which is nationalism. And based on dictionary.com, nationalism is spirit or aspirations common to the whole of a nation, excessive patriotism, the policy or doctrine of asserting the interests of one's own nation viewed as separate from the interests of other nations or the common interests of all nations. Lots of happiness, but some things that I want to focus on in these definitions are common to the whole and asserting the interest of one's own nation viewed as separate from the interests of other nations. Really what is at the heart of nationalism, and it's not really explained in these definitions, is that nationalism creates this us versus them component. So we are the Dutch, this is who Dutch is, which means anyone who isn't us is a them, doesn't belong, and isn't a part of us. And that's a really big component of nationalism, is this sense of belonging, who belongs and who doesn't. Another component, being able to easily identify who it is that belongs. So I should be able to look at you and know from looking at you that you belong in this country. So those are some really important key factors. And then, as you may have noticed, as a result, nationalism creates a dualism. Again, you belong or you don't. There's really not an in-between. So in terms of using nationalism, I'm going to analyze some interactions that I had while I was abroad. Just a brief overview, classroom experiences, my study project, my homestay experience, my internship with Radio Redmond, and when I went to Morocco for 2 weeks. So starting with my classroom experience, and again, this was just ever been in a class with. We had 14 female identifiers, 5 male identifiers, 10 people of color or biracial people, and 13 queer identifiers. So again, just a really diverse group of students, and that offered such a unique perspective and really enhanced conversation that was had throughout my semester. People familiar with CRIS studies or critical identity studies, it was nice that everyone had taken a plethora of like feminist theory and queer theory and race theory, and it just really helped to enhance conversation because we kind of had this baseline understanding of some of these I guess social terms. So moving on to my independent study project, I interviewed women of color, feminists, and activists, although a lot of them don't actively identify anymore as feminist or activist. They did at one point, and when they were doing their work, they identified as such. And I focused on just giving a voice to those women. So these were women of color that I interviewed with, and the rapport that developed happened within the first 5 minutes that I met them. And I felt really comfortable and really at ease, and I felt like my interviewees felt really comfortable and at ease. And I think that that is because of my identity, and I think I told them when I first met them that these are my identities, this is how I define myself. I told them that I identified as biracial, I told them that I was studying cultural anthropology, that I was studying race theory, and anti-racism work, and I think that as a result, that identity relays that there is a common understanding amongst us on how race works and how it is perceived, and I think that that really helped strengthen a relationship, whereas I think like my white classmates, had they done the same project, might have gotten different results, or may not have even gotten an interview at all. Something that was really particular that I noticed is that we have the Belmer interview, as I call it. As I was talking to people and saying that I am doing this project on women of color, everyone's like, you need to go to the Belmer area. That's where the black people are. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, I didn't go to the Belmer area, but I interviewed a woman who was from the Belmer area, and we did the interview in the Belmer area, and the Belmer area is in the south of Amsterdam, so like it's like Netherlands, and it's like down there. And there was a noticeable difference. As soon as I walked off the train, I could tell, like, yeah, okay, this is the black area. There was a lack of whiteness there, and I think the biggest thing that struck me in this area was that I felt invisible. And what I mean by that is I felt like I blended in. No one was staring at me, which is something that I'm really used to, is having people stare at me and then ask me questions, usually about my hair. But it just like this total like, I was just a body moving through space, and that was, even though Amsterdam, like the central city, is a really diverse and multicultural place, there's still this like heavy presence of whiteness in the city that I didn't feel when I was in the Belmer area. So my homestay, I lived with a sassy white, like super feminist, independent Dutch lady, and yeah, she was quite sassy. And then this is my sassy host sister cat, hence the picture. But what I want to talk about, and what you can see at the bottom, is the Zwarte Piet debate, or Black Piet. This is a holiday in the Netherlands, very similar to ours. It has to do with Christmas. Sinterklaas, or Santa Claus, brings presents to the children on the 5th of December, yada yada. This holiday consists of a parade where the Dutch are marching through the cities, and you have Sinterklaas, who marches through the cities, followed by his Zwarte Pietens, or Black Piets. This is what you would see. This is kind of blurry. So white people dressed in blackface. When I was there, the UN had made a statement that was like, this is like, why are you allowing blackface to happen in your city, and why are you allowing this holiday to happen? And a lot of the white Dutch were really offended, and they felt as if there were a lot of comments such as, you're taking our holiday away, this is our tradition, if you don't like it, you can leave. You're not fitting in with what we want, we're not racist, we're not hurting you. And again, so this is going back to what I was talking about with nationalism, and that us versus them, that this is us, and if you don't like it, you are a them and you can leave. So a lot, really, it was awkward. And I had a lot of conversations with my host mom about it. I had conversations, my host siblings, who were also on the side of, yes, we should get rid of this holiday. We had probably 2 or 3 conversations, 3 hours long, kind of talking about what does this holiday mean for people of color, and how does it make them feel. Moving on to my internship, Radio Redmond. As I had said before, they're an intersectional feminist group consisting of men and women of color with varying identities. They focused on anti-racism work, feminist queer and trans activism as well. And the highlight, I think, of my internship with them is that we went to a Zwarte Piet protest, as you can see from the photo that's from the protest there. And it was a peaceful protest, no one got hurt. Again, going back to like what I was talking about when I interviewed with women, this collective consisted of people of color. And once again, I think that my experience would have been very different if I was not biracial, if I had been white working with them. I think that there would have been a different rapport, a different relationship, and maybe not as deep of a relationship that I developed with these people that I developed over the course of a month and a half. I considered them family by the time I left. So then my last experience, Morocco. That's me in Morocco. So I was mistaken as Berber often, and Berber are the indigenous North Africans. When I was in the market, people often spoke to me in Arabic or maybe even Berber, but I don't really know because I don't know either language. But yeah, it was assumed until I said in French that I was from the States, and then we continued on in French. Some key moments that I noticed actually is that I had trouble with security coming back to the Netherlands. All the students of color in my program got stopped when we were trying to get our papers through, and like so many questions. So like, why are you here? Why are you going to the Netherlands? What did you have with you? What are you studying? Are you actually studying? And my program directors had to go around and release a lot of information, like stuff that didn't make sense, like the phone number of the SAT office in the States and the address in the States and a plethora of information that my white counterparts did not have to go through. And then once we landed in the Netherlands, everyone had to show their passports before they were allowed entry into the country. I flew into the Netherlands 4 times, once when I came in from the States, from Morocco, and then I took 2 solo excursions. That was the only time that I was asked to show my passport upon getting off the plane. So let's go back to nationalism and what does all of this mean? First, I want to mention that overall I had a positive experience. Nothing traumatic happened, like I wasn't hurt or anything like that. But there's definitely these noticeable notions of Dutch nationalism. When I was in the Netherlands, often people spoke to me in Dutch. I don't think that I look like I'm Dutch, but Moroccans are expected to speak Dutch. There are a lot of Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands, and they're expected to know Dutch when they come. And so whether I was taken as someone from the Netherlands or taken as a Moroccan immigrant, I was expected to know Dutch, and I wasn't read as an American, unlike some of my other classmates. Oh no, go back. Shopping is like a really small point that I want to bring up. A friend of mine loved going shopping and was like, I know you hate shopping. And I told her that it wasn't that I hated shopping, it was that the clothes weren't made for my body. Because the Dutch are seen as thin people, thin, tall people, and blonde is what they're known as. A girl in my program did a study on black bodies and fatness, and that was what she focused on, is how a lot of women of color did feel really ostracized because there weren't clothes that were readily made for them, or if there were, extremely expensive. The Belma area, as I mentioned before, the Zwarte Piet debate, and then of course my reentry after Morocco. So nationalism is something that is kind of, it's a term that's thrown around in a whole bunch of different contexts. There's black nationalism, queer nationalism, or country nationalism, such as like Dutch nationalism. And nationalism can be a really positive thing. The pros is that there's this sense of belonging, this sense of identity. You can create a collective. This was really important with queer nationalism for people who it was unsafe for them to kind of gather in public. But having this national identity of like, who are we and what does this mean and why do we matter? Really important for survival strategies. Unfortunately, the problem with nationalism is that someone or someone's decide what nationalism is and what that means. And what that means is that some people get left out. So we watched a documentary on queer blacks, and they said that black meant not being queer, but if you are a queer black person, then you don't fit in with the black nationalist identity. So lastly, what I just wanted to say is that this is one perspective. This is not by any means maybe your experience if you were to go there. This is just mine. I would be really interested in looking at how my classmates had, like what their experience was and how they viewed certain situations, and maybe situations that they had that they didn't share with us, us being the rest of the class. during their time. And so that's kind of the reflection that I have. There are a lot of those components that I mentioned back from the OIE. Again, looking at multiple perspectives, multiple identities, how do we affect each other in the space around us? And as you can see, that was kind of what was going on in my presentation. So yeah, if you have any questions, since I gave just like baselines of things that happened, please feel free to ask. I just want to real quickly mention a great thanks to Catherine Orr, who was my symposium advisor, and Lisa Anderson-Levy, who was like, you should keep a notebook while you're abroad. And I was like, oh, maybe I should. And so then I was able to record some of these experiences as a result of that. I didn't list everyone else. And then those are other people who are important. Questions / you can applaud now. Go for it. I don't know where I'm looking. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Just like, I sort of have two questions. First of all, you gave some statistics about like people in your class, but how many people were in your class? And then secondly, you mentioned a little bit that there were a lot of Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands. Can you go more in depth as to how the Netherlands and Morocco relate? Because I'm not really sure of that connection.
Yeah, so there were 19 students in total in my program. Yeah, I realized I didn't share that, which I've heard is pretty large for specifically that program. In the past, they've had like down to like 5 students. And so it's ever growing, yay. In terms of Morocco, I didn't catch that either. I did a little bit of research, and from what I gathered, there was some sort of like treaty signed, some like bilateral treaty that was signed between a couple of different countries, and I think that a lot of Moroccans went to the Netherlands to find work, and they were only going for a temporary amount of time, and then families followed, and that's how people started settling. I also know a lot of people come from Turkey, they immigrate over. I think that there's also just this notion, at least a lot of people that I talked to, not necessarily Moroccans, but like there were a lot of Jamaican immigrants that I spoke to, who talked about just this notion that we think of when we think of the Netherlands. We think freedom and acceptance and like gayness, and I think for a lot of people that identity is what they think of, and that is why they migrate there. So kind of a vague answer, I'm sorry. All in.
I was wondering how the holiday was perceived in the black part of Amsterdam.
In the Belmer area?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there were, let me see if I can go back quickly, maybe not. Well, I'll talk while I'm going back. So there were a lot of that poster from the Radio Redmond group that was all over this with Zwarte Piet and the cross through it. When I did my interview, I did it before the parade on the 5th. Well, okay, so there's like the 17th of November, which is like the day when that's the parade, and then the 5th is when presents are handed out, and I didn't quite understand why there was a split, but there was. And so this icon, they created stickers and like all different kinds of advertising, and then just plastered the Belmer area, but also the city of Amsterdam, the trams, public transportation, and like shops with this sticker that was kind of a way to rebel. I know that there were protests happening in the Belmer area as well as in Amsterdam, and just people really coming together. There's a Facebook group called Zwarte Piet is Racisme, which is Zwarte Piet is racist, and you can find that. It's in Dutch, so I can't really tell you what they're talking about there, but I know that that's a collective that's also come together as well. Did that kind of get at what you were asking? No, Redmond is focused in Amsterdam. They do their activism all over, but they're mainly focused in Amsterdam, just because they're small and they're new. They're less than a year old, and it's a lot of people who have majored or who have like masters in anti-racism work. So this protest, this photo is from a square in Amsterdam. Stephanie. Right.
But did anyone deny the fact that you were American when you would say that you are American? Like ask you, then why don't you look white or?
Oh, I see. No, I didn't get that, but I think that I have like the Midwestern accent, which is considered like standard English. I think that might have given it away a little bit. But I got a lot of in Morocco, like, are you sure you're not Berber? You look Berber. Are you sure it's not in there? And I'm like, not that I'm aware of. So there was like more shock from the Moroccans that I wasn't Berber than I got from the Dutch. But I was also in the city of Amsterdam, and I think like as a tourist spot, they see a lot of different people. Did you have a question, Ron? Oh, okay. Rock on. Oh, cool, we have time for one more. Lisa. Oh, no.
So at some place in your presentation, you pointed to maybe the beginning of in the Netherlands, and a question I'm going to ask you if you think that, right? Because the Netherlands has had these
Yeah.
colonial relationships over the world that are predicated on a particular kind of usness and femness, right, that lends itself to racism. So I don't know if you would have thought about that. What you meant when you said beginning of racism.
Yeah, so what I gathered from the people that I interviewed with is that it was in that moment that I guess white people started, I guess like the fear kind of came out. Sorry? Correct. Yeah. So there were a lot of white Dutch settlers in some of those places that I mentioned, and they actually, it was really sad. There was a photo that was shared in class, and it's like, look at this happy white Dutchman as he walks through like the Dutch Antilles, but like in the background it's like super impoverished, but he's wearing his business suit and his top hat. And you see that disconnect in that photo of like, okay, this is how those people are actually living, and this is how you are living, and you are bringing that there. I think that with the hijacking, though, I think that was the first time that for the white Dutch that I was like, oh, like maybe these people will rebel against us, or maybe activism is going to take place, whereas I don't know if that was necessarily thought of before. And I'm sure that there are probably some collectives who had been thinking about that prior to that moment. That was just a couple of women noted that experience, and I was like, I should do some research on that. Is that good? Okay, and that's the end.